Electromagnetic pulse preparedness is probably the most misunderstood topic in the entire prepping community. And that misunderstanding isn't just confusing, it is actively dangerous. When you focus your energy and resources preparing for the wrong scenarios based on faulty information, you leave real, critical vulnerabilities wide open. I have spent years sorting through vast amounts of electromagnetic pulse information, sifting through technical papers, military testing results, and expert analyses. What I found genuinely surprised me. Most of what people believe about these events isn't just slightly off the mark, it is often completely backwards. Some of these persistent myths could genuinely put you in a worse position if a significant event actually occurred, because they divert your attention from what truly matters. Today, we are going to walk through 11 specific myths that keep circulating, explain what the reality actually looks like based on evidence, and discuss what that practically means for how you prepare. We are not going to deal in scare tactics or science fiction scenarios. We are interested only in the facts and what you can actually do with them to improve your position. Before we dive into the specifics, let me be absolutely clear about one thing. I am not here to tell you that electromagnetic pulse threats do not exist, or that you shouldn't prepare for them. The threat is real, given the geopolitical landscape and our reliance on vulnerable technology. However, my goal is to help you prepare effectively based on what would actually happen physically and societally, rather than preparing based on what makes for good television drama or frightening YouTube thumbnails. The difference between those two approaches is enormous, and it is essentially the difference between preparedness that actually helps you survive and recover versus preparedness that wastes your limited time and money on fantasies. Let's start with perhaps the biggest and most pervasive myth of them all. Myth 1 is the idea that an electromagnetic pulse will fry everything electronic instantly. This is the Hollywood version of events that we have all seen. In the movies, every single device goes dark at the exact same split second. Cars immediately crash into each other, planes fall out of the sky, and everything with a circuit board becomes an instant paperweight. The reality is significantly more complicated, and honestly much more manageable than that total wipeout scenario. Electromagnetic pulses affect electronics differently based on a variety of factors, including what the device is, its physical size, whether it is turned on or off at the moment of impact, whether it is plugged into the wall grid, and how well it is inherently shielded. A plugged-in appliance connected to the massive antenna of the power grid is far more vulnerable than a cell phone sitting isolated in a kitchen drawer. Modern cars are a prime example of this misunderstanding. Despite what you have likely heard repeated endlessly, modern vehicles are actually surprisingly resistant to electromagnetic effects because their electronic systems are already heavily shielded against everyday electromagnetic interference. They have to be shielded, otherwise they wouldn't work reliably while surrounded by all the other electronics in the car itself, let alone the radio frequency noise of a modern city. The Defense Department conducted actual testing on this specific issue. They exposed a variety of vehicles, both older models and newer ones, to simulated electromagnetic pulse environments. The results were telling. Some vehicles experienced temporary glitches on their dashboards, and some engines stalled but could be restarted. Most of them kept running without issue. But the pervasive idea that every single car on the road just dies instantly did not hold up in realistic testing environments. In fact, the testing revealed something very interesting that runs counter to common intuition. Vehicles from the 1980s and 1990s, which people often assume are safer because their technology seems simpler, actually failed at similar rates to modern vehicles. The reason is that modern vehicles have much better integrated shielding because they absolutely need it to prevent interference between their complex internal electronic systems. Your car's central computer has to work reliably right next to your powerful radio transmitter, your GPS receiver, your phone's Bluetooth signal, and everything else running in that confined space. That built-in shielding that makes all those systems play nicely together also provides a significant degree of protection against external electromagnetic pulses. What does fail more reliably and catastrophically are long conductor systems. We are talking about power transmission lines that span hundreds of miles, massive transformers, and widespread communication infrastructure. Those are the systems that create the real, societally disruptive problems, not necessarily the isolated device in your pocket. Think about it from a physics perspective. An electromagnetic pulse induces electrical current in conductors. The longer the conductor, the more current it can pick up from the pulse. Your phone's internal circuits are measured in millimeters. A cross-country power transmission line is measured in hundreds of miles. The difference in vulnerability between those two things is massive. Therefore, the real danger isn't primarily that your personal flashlight or wristwatch stops working. The danger is that the massive interconnected systems you depend on to get food delivered to grocery stores, water pumped to your tap, fuel supplied to gas stations, and information sent to your screen all stop working at the same time for an extended period. That is a very different problem to prepare for than just worrying about individual gadgets. It means your focus should be on building independence from those large-scale support systems, not just on trying to protect every piece of consumer electronics you own. It means thinking deeply about how you will eat, drink, stay warm, and gather essential information when the national infrastructure goes down, regardless of whether your personal tablet survives the initial event. This leads directly into the second major misunderstanding. Myth 2 is the belief that you need a Faraday cage for absolutely everything. Once people learn about the concept of Faraday cages, it often becomes their hammer for every nail related to EMP preparedness. I understand the appeal because Faraday cages absolutely do work based on sound scientific principles. The principle is solid, but the execution in the prepping community is where people often go completely off the rails. First of all, most everyday electronics do not need to be in a Faraday cage right now because they aren't that vulnerable when they are unplugged and turned off. The real vulnerability lies in systems connected to the grid. You putting your spare television remote control inside a metal trash can isn't addressing the actual threat to your survival. Second, if you are going to take the time and effort to shield something, you need to understand exactly what you are protecting and why it matters. A backup emergency radio makes sense to shield because information will be currency. A way to charge batteries like a small solar setup makes sense. Perhaps a spare old phone or tablet that you have loaded up with downloaded survival manuals, medical references, and maps makes sense. But I see people obsessively trying to Faraday cage their everyday laptop that is already 5 years out of date, or protecting streaming devices that won't be useful at all if the internet infrastructure is down. You are not going to be streaming movies after a major EMP event, so why are you expending resources protecting the streaming stick? I have seen people meticulously construct shielding for old desktop computers, obsolete game consoles, electric can openers, and digital picture frames. They are spending valuable time and money protecting devices that either won't help them in a true grid-down scenario, or that they could easily replace later once things stabilize. Meanwhile, these same people often haven't stored 2 weeks of water or learned basic first aid skills. Third, proper Faraday shielding is more specific than many people realize. It isn't just about putting something in a metal box. The box needs to fully enclose the item with absolutely no significant gaps. The item inside cannot touch the conductive metal walls directly, or you risk creating a path for the energy to travel through. And not all metals shield equally well against all frequencies. A standard galvanized metal trash can with a tightly fitting lid actually works pretty well for a DIY solution. Aluminum foil wrapped carefully in multiple layers around a device that is first placed inside a cardboard box works okay for small items, but people wrapping things loosely in a single layer of foil with gaps at the corners and calling it done are not achieving what they think they are achieving. The physics of Faraday cages is actually quite fascinating. You're essentially creating a conductive enclosure that continuously redirects the electromagnetic energy around the outside of the contents rather than allowing it to pass through them. But that only works if the enclosure is electrically complete. Every gap, every seam, every tiny opening is a potential entry point for electromagnetic energy. The size of the gap matters too, because smaller wavelengths of energy can penetrate smaller openings, which is why fine conductive mesh often works better than coarse chicken wire for higher frequency threats. Here is the better, more balanced approach to shielding. Identify 2 or 3 critical electronic items that would genuinely help you survive, gather information, or communicate if the grid went down long term. Shield those items properly and store them somewhere accessible. Most importantly, make sure you have a way to power them that doesn't depend on the wall outlet. For most people, that list should be short. A battery-powered or hand-crank emergency radio for receiving news, a way to charge standard AA or AAA batteries through small solar panels, and perhaps one consolidated digital device with essential reference data. That is it. 3 items properly protected with a realistic off-grid power solution. That is proportional preparedness. Turning your garage into a museum of shielded, useless electronics is not. Myth 3 is the belief that an EMP means absolutely zero communication with the outside world. This myth leads people to either give up entirely on the idea of staying informed, or to spend thousands of dollars on complex ham radio setups that they never actually learn how to use properly. The truth is that communication gets much harder, slower, and more fragmented, but it doesn't vanish completely. Local communication still works quite well. If you have a shielded walkie-talkie and your neighbor has one, you can still talk to each other. If someone 3 blocks over has a working radio, they might hear you. The effective distance shrinks dramatically, but the fundamental ability to transmit and receive radio waves doesn't vanish from physics. Standard consumer radios, the kind you buy in blister packs at outdoor stores, have a realistic range of a few miles in ideal open conditions. In an urban environment surrounded by concrete and steel buildings, that range might shrink to half a mile or even less, but that is still enough range to coordinate with nearby neighbors, to share information about security watches, or to organize mutual aid efforts within your immediate vicinity. Older forms of broadcast, specifically AM radio, might still work and could be surprisingly resilient. If radio station transmission equipment survives and they have backup generator power, they can broadcast. AM signals have a physical advantage because they can travel much farther than FM or digital television signals, especially at night when they bounce off the ionosphere. AM transmitters are often technically simpler and easier to repair or run on backup power than complex modern digital broadcasting systems. If any broadcast medium survives a major event and recovers quickly to provide official information, it will likely be AM radio stations. So that dusty old AM radio you have in the garage might end up being much more valuable than you currently think. And here is the biggest thing people miss about communication. Human communication networks do not require electronics to function. After disasters like Hurricane Katrina, major earthquakes, or the crisis in Puerto Rico, information still moved through communities. People talked to each other face to face. They walked down the street to check on elderly relatives. They organized in person at community centers or churches. It is slower, it is less convenient, and it is prone to rumors, but humans have been coordinating complex activities without electronics for thousands of years. An electromagnetic pulse doesn't erase that inherent human capacity. In fact, one of the most effective communication networks after any disaster is always word of mouth. Someone walks to the functioning water source and reports back on the situation. Someone rides a bicycle to check on the next town over and brings back news. Someone posts a handwritten note at a central gathering point, informing others of available resources. These methods seem primitive to us now, but they work, and they have worked through every disaster in human history. So yes, having a backup electronic communication device makes sense, but the myth that you will be completely isolated in a silent world the second the pulse hits is not how communities actually function in real crises. Connection finds a way. The key is to think about communication in layers. Electronic communication is the fastest, but also the most fragile layer. Direct personal communication is the slowest, but the most reliable layer. You need to plan for both. Know your neighbors now before anything happens, establish meeting points for your family, agree on ways to leave physical messages if electronics fail. These non-technical solutions often matter far more in the first week of a disaster than technical ones. Myth 4 is that solar panels will inevitably be fried. This myth is particularly damaging because it keeps many people from investing in solar power, which is arguably one of the most practical backup power options available for regular residential settings. Here's the reality of how EMP affects solar energy systems. Solar panels themselves are remarkably durable pieces of technology. They are essentially just silicon wafers sandwiched inside a sealed glass and aluminum frame. There really isn't much complex circuitry inside the panel itself to fry. The real vulnerability in a solar setup is in the charge controller and the inverter. These are the electronic components that manage the raw power coming from the panels and convert it into usable electricity for your home or batteries. Yes, if those components are connected to a large conductor system during a pulse, they could certainly be damaged by the voltage spike. But if you keep a spare, shielded charge controller and inverter disconnected from your system, the risk drops significantly. Even if your primary controller is damaged, replacing a charge controller is vastly easier and cheaper than replacing an entire rooftop array of solar panels. A typical residential solar setup might cost between $15,000 and $30,000. The panels themselves make up the bulk of that cost. The charge controller and inverter together might cost $2,000 or $3,000. If you lose those electronic components, you have lost perhaps 10% of your total monetary investment, and those are the specific components you can store spares of. People also forget that solar is not an all-or-nothing proposition. Even if you lose the ability to efficiently feed power back into a large household battery bank or the grid, you can still use solar panels in crude ways to trickle-charge small devices directly in an extreme emergency. It is not elegant and it carries some risks to the batteries you are charging, but it works when nothing else does. I have tested this myself in field conditions.